Welcome to the Keeping It Israel podcast with Jeff Feuders, where Jeff and his guests talk everything Israel as it relates to Christian faith and the church. If you are a Christian and you stand with Israel, you will be encouraged and challenged by this podcast. And if you're not so sure about the whole Israel thing, you need to learn how your faith connects with Israel and why standing with Israel matters. Now here's Jeff with today's guest.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of the Keeping It Israel podcast. My name is Jeff. I'm your host, and my guest today is Rabbi Ken Spiro. Ken is a yeshiva teacher. He's a religious Jew, teaches at Aish HaTorah in the city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem. And Ken has an incredible mind. He's an amazing historian. He's also a licensed tour guide. He'll tell you a number of those things about him. We're going to talk today about Israel and the journey toward peace in the Middle East. And Ken will comment some of his thoughts about how we got here and also what this most recent peace deal, the Abraham Accord, will mean for Israel. And I know you're going to find this interesting. Let's join Ken and myself as we chat together about peace in the Middle East. Welcome to the podcast, and it's great to have you with us today. My guest today is Rabbi Ken Spiro from Aish HaTorah. And Ken, you are doing this part-time. You also have a number of other gigs. Tell us a little bit more about all that you're doing, first of all, before we jump into our topic today.
Thanks for having me on the show, by the way. I've become an expert at Zoom in the last 7 months.
We all
Basically,
have.
I speak in various formats. Expat American living in Israel going on 39 years now. I'm living in the old city of Jerusalem. You can see in the image, I gotta get the right way. There's that image, I got the backwards. I'm not standing outside the Jaffa Gate. It's a picture I took during the first lockdown. Now we're in lockdown number 2. I teach part-time in a yeshiva, an institution for Jewish education in the old city called Aish HaTorah. It's my part-time job. I'm also a licensed tour guide, speaker, author, historian. So I mix and match the same skills in different formats and locations.
Yeah. And Ken, if people want to find out more about what you do, I know you have a website. What's your website for our listeners?
Yes, so my website is Ken Spiro, KENSP, as in Peter, IRO, and kenspiro.com. It's all my content is on there for free. Listen, lots of video content. Listen, read, and watch on history, Jewish history, religion, politics, morality. Lots of good stuff up there.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure that we print that also below so that people who are watching can get it off the screen. We'll put it in all of the transcripts and so on. Ken, it has been great, I should say, to get to know you over the last few years. Our mutual friend, Chris Atkins from One Media, who I know that you've been connecting with for a number of years now. And he introduced us. We have been able to get together a number of times. And I love the perspective that you bring, especially on the impact of a lot of what has been happening in the world as it relates to Israel and to the sort of Arab-Palestinian conflict. And I use the word conflict to start, but what I want us to sort of lean towards is the peace side of that equation. And for the last 70 plus years, there's been this issue going on in Israel. And I want you just to help our listeners perhaps understand a little better this journey towards peace, I'll call it, because I know it's all about perspective. And I think from the Israeli side, I'm fairly confident from the Israeli side that they would want this to be a journey towards peace. We're not sure that everyone always feels that way, though. So just talk a little bit about the last 70 years and kind of what's been going on.
Okay, it's a huge question, but I'll try and simplify it. Peace process for dummies. Not that you guys listening are dummies, but it really is, because there's a lot of confusion about it, because the media tends to put a spin on it. This cycle of violence. I hate that. And I might sound like I'm taking a side in this. I'm a religious Jew living in Israel, but I think I like to believe that I'm being 100% factual when I say all the following things. Although it certainly will point a finger in a certain direction as to who's responsible for the lack of peace. The real issue, Jeff, has always been the Palestinian thing is a smokescreen. I could do a whole class on the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the Palestinian claim, given there never was a Palestinian people in the ancient world. There were Philistines, but no Palestinians. They're not related. But I always like to tell people, I say it's never been about creating a Palestinian state. That's a smokescreen. The issue has been, even before Israel was born as a state in 1948, the inability of the Arab world collectively to accept the existence of a Jewish state of any size with any borders. And as to why that is so, I have multiple presentations on. Much of it has to do with the Islamic worldview about territory that was controlled by Muslims. And even though we Jewish people were in the land of Israel 1,900 years, Joshua leads the Jews into Israel 1,900 years before Omar ibn al-Khattab, the square at Jaffa Gate in back of me over there is named after him, brought Muslims in conquering, the Middle East to Jerusalem. That was 1,900 years later. So the train of thought just pulled out without me on it. I have to apologize.
No worries.
The Arab world did control the Middle East for 1,300 years. Different Islamic dynasties. Umayyads and Abbasids, Ayyubids, Mamelukes, Seljuks, Ottomans. So it was Islamic territory, but they're not the indigenous people. Part of the Islamic worldview is the idea that what is Islamic can never go back to being non-Islamic, and that non-Muslim monotheists that are called dhimmi, which are you and I, by the way, Christians and Jews, are never allowed to rule over, even if it's benignly, over Muslims. So the creation of State of Israel is, in both those aspects, impossible to accept theologically from Muslims. It's territory that was under Islamic control. It's now under control of dhimmi, who, albeit in a democracy, 20% of the Israeli population are Arabs, most of them Muslims. But still, that's kind of theologically unacceptable. It's politically unacceptable. But if you study the history, even before Israel declared itself a state, the Arab world has been rejecting the notion of a Jewish state of any size. Nothing to do with borders or occupation of supposed Palestinian territory. They called for Israel's destruction before Israel was even born in 1948. And every time that Israel's tried to offer to live at peace in compromising, it's been rejected. Ben Gurion, the first prime minister, when he reads the Declaration of Independence, calls for peace with all our Arab neighbors. And the Arab world immediately declares war on Israel. The Egyptian Air Force bombs Tel Aviv 2 hours later, and 5 Arab armies declare war and invade. And even before 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel got a hold of those territories, which everyone likes to call the West Bank, Jerusalem was a divided city. Jordan sat in the entire, eastern side of the city and the old city. And they were still trying to destroy us. But what led to the 67 war, which led to Israel's supposed occupation, which I think is an incorrect term, was yet a second attempt in 67 of the Arab world to destroy the Jewish state. Immediately after that war, Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, again says, we'll give the territory back, just make peace with us. The Arab world rejects it again. Finally, 1979, it's interesting, Jeff, that Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of the revisionist Zionist movement, he's like the grandfather of the political right in Israel, the Likud party. He had a saying. It was called the Iron Wall, but he said the Arabs will only make peace with us when they realize they can't destroy us. So after the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War, which although Israel really won, it was viewed as a victory by the Egyptians. At least they were, for a brief period of time, able to grab some territory from Israel, even though they lost it all again. Egypt in 79 makes peace. And what does Israel do? Israel is the only country that, instead of doing peace for peace, which is the normal deal, it's land for peace. Israel gives what's called the Sinai, which is bigger than the state of Israel, to Egypt for what turned out to be a very cold peace treaty. But nonetheless, it was a game changer. That happened again in 1994 with Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein of Jordan. Not so much territory was changed, but what we see over and over again is that every time an Arab state has been willing to break with we're not accepting a Jewish state of any size, Israel's not only willingly made peace, but sacrificed territory, deep strategic territory. In 1993 with the Oslo Accords, they pulled out of large chunks of Judea and Samaria, giving it to the Palestinian Authority, which then launched a number of terrorist wars against Israel, the Intifadas. In 2000 and 2007, we had both Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert offered Arafat to withdraw to the pre-67, basically, ceasefire lines that preceded the Six-Day War, and to redivide Jerusalem. And Arafat said no. So, the only thing stopping the creation of a Palestinian entity, state, whatever you want, is the Palestinian recognizing. Even Arafat said, the day I make peace with Israel is the last day I'm alive, because the factions within his own people would kill him. Mm-hmm. So it's always been about that, until we've seen now a bit of a game changer in the recent peace treaties. But I've already been talking for too long, so I'll let you go back and comment and ask me some more questions.
Yeah. So before we move on to this most recent game changer, which I'm very, very intrigued to hear your take on, talk to us a little bit about that idea that the Palestinian state is just a smokescreen. Talk to us about who were the people before 1947 who were in the land, what were they called, and how do we get from Arab residents of Judea or Palestine to Palestinians?
Sure, that's a great question, and one people do not understand. The whole term Palestine comes from the Philistines. The Philistines are a seafaring people. We're not exactly sure of their origins, but most historians, archaeologists believe they migrated from the area that is today Greece many, many thousands of years ago, Middle Bronze period, which is the time of Abraham, and earlier even, 3,000 plus years ago. Mm-hmm. They're not the indigenous population. Only Canaanites, who don't exist anymore, which is a generic term used for 7 different people, the Hittites and the Prizzites and the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem before it was a Jewish city. They're the only people who could claim, if they still existed, to be more authentic and indigenous to the land. So these Philistines migrated for various reasons across the Mediterranean and settled in not just Israel, but the Sinai and what is today Lebanon and Syria. And you could see in the Bible, King David is always fighting with them. A lot of people in the book of Judges, everyone's always fighting with these guys. They ceased to exist 2,500 years ago when the Assyrians, who were the great world power coming out of what is today the area of Iraq, more or less ended them. Like they ended the northern kingdom of Israel, just moved them somewhere else and they're gone. The name, however, was preserved by Greek Roman writers, like Roman historians. If you fast forward to the 2nd century of the Common Era, which corresponds to from 132 to 135, was the 3rd major revolt of the Jews against the Romans and the biggest revolt in the history of the Roman Empire, which was called the Bar Kokhba revolt. When the Romans, after with great difficulty, crushed that revolt, they decided, we've had it with you Jews. Like you're such troublemakers. So what do? They go after Judaism. They're basically trying to destroy Judaism. But they decided one of the best ways to end you as a people is to end your connection to your country. So those of you who survived physically, because so many Jews had died, we're going to first of all change the whole name of the country. We used to call it, the Romans said, the Roman province of Judea after the Jews. Now we're going to name it after these extinct people we're going to call it Philistia. And we're going to rename all the cities in the country non-Jewish names. We're going to rename the city of Shechem, where Joseph is buried. We're going to rename it Naples, much nicer Italian name. Now, by the way, Arabs don't have a P sound. Like they don't say pita bread, they say pita bread. So they call it Nablus. We're going to rename Jerusalem, which, by the way, we're going to rebuild as a pagan Roman city, plowing the Temple Mount under, building a temple to Jupiter on it. We're going to ban Jews from entering it. Cut Jews off from their spiritual and political capital. Hopefully they'll disappear on us. We're going to rename it Aelia Capitolina after the Roman Emperor Hadrian. So that's where the term Philistia really gets associated with the land of Israel. That term, there's no country. We lose our second commonwealth, and different empires will come in. You have Romans, and you have Byzantines, then you have all these Islamic nations, Umayyads, Abbasids, Ayyubids, Mamluks, Seljuks, Ottomans, then the British come. The term Philistia, well, the Europeans will pick up on it and call this area the Levant, the greater area around us, the Levant, but also call it Palestine. Mm-hmm. Not in association with a group of people, just sort of preserving that Roman name geographically. What's interesting is the only people who call themselves, fast forward to Jews returning with the founding of Zionism in the early 19th, basically late 19th, early 20th centuries, the only people who called themselves Palestinians were the Jewish people resettling in the land. The Jerusalem Post, which is the newspaper's original name, is the Palestine Post. El Al's original name, Israel's airline, was Palestine Airways. The Arabs called themselves Arabs. So in 1948, when Israel becomes a state, the Arabs continued to call themselves Arabs. They might call they might refer to, they're not going to refer to the land as Israel. So they would still call it Palestine, because that's what everyone referred to it as. And the Jews changed their name to Israelis. Only in the mid-1960s, Ahmed Suqeri, and later with Yasser Arafat, with Al-Fatah, it's a whole complicated, I don't want to get into too many details. By the way, they create the Palestine Liberation Organization, which, interesting for most people don't know this, that was created basically by the Soviet Union through the Romanian Secret Service. And it was basically used because in the mid-1960s, then sort of the Cold War in the Middle East is going to break out, with the Soviets backing the Arab countries and America basically taking strong side with Israel. And it will be used, that whole Palestinian issue will be used sort of to delegitimize the Jewish claim to the land of Israel, using a people who never existed as a people before to try and sort of deny the original inhabitants a connection to their land. The whole refugee issue, we know, is a byproduct of, first of all, the 1948 war.
Yep.
Because you read these history books, they say 1948 war broke out between the Arab states and Israel. War didn't break out. War doesn't. It's World War I. You could say broke out. It's very complicated, but Israel calls for peace. The Arabs call for war, declare war, and invade. Had they not invaded, there'd be no refugee issue. Many of the Arabs who left fled the fighting to get out of the way of the fighting. Many of the Arab states told the Arabs, move out of the way so we can, you're not in the line of fire, so we can kill the Jews, dump what's left into the sea, and then you can move back in again. Israel definitely cleared out some villages, especially on the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway, where they were attacking, trying to cut Israel off. They did. They closed the road. They were trying to starve Jerusalem into submission. So there was definitely Arab communities that were cleared out. Those refugees went to different surrounding Arab states where they were never reabsorbed. By the way, at the same time, between 48 and 67, a greater number of Sephardic Jews from the Middle East, living in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria. By the way, these Jews had been living in places like Iraq for 2,500 years, way before Islam ever came into existence. The entire Middle East was made Judenrein, which is the German term for Jew-free. It was ethnically cleansed of 3/4 of 1 million Jews who many of them lost their lives, but most of them lost their property, public, communal property, businesses. The vast majority were absorbed by the Jewish state and are now a good chunk of the Sephardic Jewish population. Many went to places like France and Montreal. They spoke French if they were from Morocco or something. Meanwhile, those Arabs sort of festered in these camps. Palestinians are the only refugees in the world who maintain refugee status 3, 4, 5, 6 generations later. Another wave of Palestinian refugees was caused in 67 when the Arab world again tried to destroy Israel.
Right.
And this time this was only 3 Arab armies, but this time Jerusalem, the Jordanians were pushed back, Syria was pushed out of the Golan Heights, Israel so that only further increased. But these people have been kept in this festering situation, denied citizenship. And used as a whip to delegitimize the Jewish people, where they could have been absorbed into the countries the way Israel absorbed all those refugees who were thrown out of their countries. And they remain in a unique refugee status, which is unique to them alone in the world.
So talk to me a little bit more about that. You indicated that this situation is being used in order to delegitimize Israel. Is it fact that that the Arab states around have actually stated this, or are we just assuming that this is what's happening?
Yeah, the fact that they don't recognize a Jewish state's right to exist is de facto a recognition if you have no right to be there.
Of course.
You can't tell a people, you have a right to be there, we're going to kill you. Their whole claim to be attacking Israel, because everyone, even evil people in history, I know, always like to justify their agendas with some higher cause. Even Hitler conquering Europe, we were just conquering it to make the world a better place for a higher German civilization and get more land for our people. We're not just slaughtering people for no reason. So de facto, yes, that's exactly what they're claiming. And backing them have been a lot of international organizations, many political ideologies, much of the left has bought into this narrative in many countries. Many of the revolutionary movements in the world, there's sort of an interesting connection between the ANC in South Africa and the Palestine Liberation Organization and the Irish Republican Army and all of these revolutionary movements in South and Central America. It's sort of like a package deal of revolutionary movements to right wrongs, regardless of how wrong the rights are, right the wrongs are. So this narrative is actually taken hold to a tremendous extent. To make peace with Israel involves, on a certain level, even if you're not officially going to state it, a notion that you guys are here to stay. Whether I think you have a right to be here to stay is a different story, but at least I'm going to recognize that you are here and you are a reality. The irony of this whole thing is the notion that the Jewish people have been written out of their history. This is so bad that even UNESCO, most of the holy sites in Israel, almost every village and town, even the Arab ones, are built on pre-existing Jewish sites, with the exception of Ramla. Pretty much every Arab city or town, whether it's in Judea, Samaria, or in Israel proper, is built on a pre-existing biblical Jewish location. But now even, international bodies like UNESCO have written Jews out of their own history. They recognize, the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron is recognized as an Islamic holy site. The Temple Mount is not called the Temple Mount anymore. It's recognized as it's the holy site in the world for the Jews, but there's no connection. It's not recognized. The Palestinian, we talk about the Palestinians being refugees. They're bounced from place to place. They try and overthrow Jordan in 1970. The Jordanians chuck them out. They go to Lebanon. They destabilize Lebanon with this very delicate balance of Christians, Muslims, Shiites, Sunnis. Civil war breaks out there. They use it as a launching base to attack Israel from the north. Israel goes into Lebanon in 1982. Finally, 1993, under Yitzhak Rabin, they invite these people back in the land of Israel, giving them guns. They settle, but it was contingent. The Oslo Accords were contingent on each side recognizing its historical and religious connection to Jerusalem, the land of Israel, even though the Jewish connection is much deeper, longer, whatever. But each side will recognize Israel by letting the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority back in and giving them guns and everything else clearly did that. The Palestinian Authority fell very short on keeping their side of the deal. And until today, I can show you, there's not one map, textbook, political leader, Palestinian archaeologist or historian that will admit that there ever was a Jewish presence in Israel before Zionism, that there ever was a temple in Jerusalem. So the intransigence of the Palestinians, and they've actually raised several generations of their own people who are so brainwashed with this rhetoric that they actually truly really believe that the Jews are the foreign white colonialist occupier, which, by the way, is the narrative that much of the left has picked up around Europe and stuff, that Israel is a vestige of white colonialism. Jews are all white people. They're from Europe. It's all lies. And we now have a people who are completely unwilling to negotiate. No matter how many times we offer them everything they want, they keep saying no. And
so before we're going to get right to the Abraham Accord after this question, I promise, but talk to me about the irony of the League of Nations, who originally helped to make the case for a Jewish state in the land of Israel or Palestine at the time. How does the League of Nations become the United Nations, who now today are very, very far away from any sort of support, in my estimation, of the state of Israel? How do we get there?
So that's also a very interesting process. The British, who were the major world power in this, before you're talking about World War I up to World War II, there was a lot of sympathy, even though there was a lot of pro-Arab sentiment amongst the British government, there was a lot of sympathy for the British to support the creation of a Jewish state. There was a certain level of that around the world. But when the UN is created, which is post-World War II, and I always say when I'm guiding in Yad Vashem, which is the National Holocaust Memorial Site in Israel, I get to the end, of the narrative, and Israel's reborn in the ashes of the Holocaust. And I say, if there's any silver lining to the Holocaust, because the darkest clouds in Jewish history always have a silver lining, I say it's the creation of a Jewish state. I always say that the world, my perspective, because I am a historian and a rabbi, so I always say I wear two hats. I wear my little rabbi hat, but I wear my historian hat. And I always try to look at it from the perspective of, on high down, and from the bottom looking up. I always say the world historically has not been able to really deal with Jews as victors. They prefer Jews as victims. That's the standard model we've lived in, pushed from country to country throughout Europe, persecuted, killed, blamed for poisoning whales and being in league with the devil. And there's almost an algorithm you can come up with: how many Jews are killed versus how much sympathy Israel gets. I think it took 6 million Jews dying for the world to feel sorry enough for the Jewish people, for the UN to vote November 29th, 1947 in Flushing Meadow. That's before they moved to the east side. 33-13 with 10 abstentions. Thank God abstentions didn't count in the vote, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. To create a Jewish state. So there you had, it was the vote. You see the famous images of everyone waiting by the radios to see, will the world sanction the creation of a Jewish state? It wasn't a clear-cut thing that was going to happen. But what has happened since then, and Israel was largely perceived as the little David surrounded by the Goliath. 22 states of the Arab League, 5.5 million square miles of territory. Today it's 300 million Arabs versus Israel, 10,500 square miles of territory. Less than 7 million Jews. It's a little bit lopsided. That was the original thing. The combination of sympathy for the Holocaust in Israel, like this little David against the Goliath. But what's happened with Israel's surviving and prospering, even winning major victories, and the Cold War influence is from, especially after '67 war, and to the present, the narrative has largely, due to a lot of hard work on the part of disinformation and propaganda, has changed to Israel is now the conflict has been microtized to Israel as the Goliath, the Palestinians are the David, and Israel is no longer legitimate, and all the sympathy that came about because of the Holocaust and the guilt that was in European consciousness for either actively or not proactively doing something to save Jews or actively killing them has worn off. And now they're kind of sick of being beaten. I heard a kind of very cynical line: Germany's never forgiven the Jews for the Holocaust. they're sick of feeling guilty. And if they can, and I'm not saying all Europeans are doing this, but I think a lot, especially on the left, and even on the hard right too, both extremes are never good, are basically, if we could turn the Jews into the Nazis, and the Palestinians into the Jews, and Israel, and the lies that come out that Israeli army harvests Palestinian organs and is committing a genocide against. Give me a break! You got to be kidding! If we can turn the Jews into the Nazis, so to speak, and they actually use swastika emblems in the anti-Israel cartoons now. They turn the 6 lines of the Star of David into a swastika, and we could turn the Palestinians into the Jews. Then the Jews are really no better than the Germans. We don't have to feel the Nazis were. We don't have to feel guilty anymore. And we can first ideologically undo our support for Israel and then physically undo it. And let's just get rid of this little annoying moral thorn in our side, which is kind of messing up our narrative. That's my kind of cynical take on it. But that's how the world has transformed from being pro-Israel, sympathetic and supporting the creation of a Jewish state, to now U.S., Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Australia, Canada, when Stephen Harper was prime minister for sure, A few other places are staunchly pro-Israel, and the rest are standing on the sidelines or actively kind of condemning us. It's kind of scary.
Very, very interesting insight. And so when we think about all of that and where that situation sort of lies today, how huge is this recent deal between, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, brokered by, the great controversial leader of the United States? Can we say his name? I guess we.
Yeah,
sure. Donald Trump. How huge is this, and what does it mean for Israel right now?
Well, first of all, I have to give Trump credit. I don't know what listeners think of him or not. The guy's a businessman. I'm a big believer, by the way, nothing to do with Trump, but that, businessmen should run states, cities, and countries because they're all businesses. Right. Trump understood one thing. I think he's, The Art of the Deal. He wrote this book. I never read it, but he understood, that there's a quote attributed to Albert Einstein, which he didn't say, but the definition of insanity is repeating the same mistake over and over, repeating the same experiment over and over again, expecting a different result.
Mm-hmm.
The Palestinians have gotten to this mold of, we can continually attack Israel, violate all of our agreements, say no to everything, and the world will restrain Israel and always give us another chance to say no and support us and pour billions of dollars into our economy and yada, yada, yada. And it's like, it ain't working. This has been going on since 48. So Trump says, I'm going to try something completely different. And remember, like, first of all, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital. Oh my God, the world's going to explode. The Middle East is going to blow. Nothing. It was unbelievable how little happened. And then he makes this deal, because the Palestinians were smart and really wanted peace. They have the best arrangement of any Arabs in the world. The neighbors of Israel. Let's just make peace. We'll have all these industrial parks and high-tech parks together with those Jewish people who are so creative and Silicon Wadi, and they're so, they'll think of all the great ideas. We have cheap labor. We got the Arabs around us with all this cheap energy. The Middle East could be like China on steroids. And that's because they see Israel, Arabs may not like Israel. They respect Israel democracy and they respect Israel innovation, even the ones who hate our guts. So Trump says, no, let's try something different. So he tried his new, the deal of the century thing, which didn't get off the ground, but I think it shook people up to realize we got to try a different formula. And also the Arabs have bigger fish to fry. The notion of pan-Arab unity is gone. This is a topic we could talk about, Jeff, for hours, but the Arab world may yell and scream about Israel, but trust me, Shiites and Sunnis, the Iranians are Shiites, Hezbollah, Shiite, these guys hate each other's guts. And there's a big power struggle going on between, Sunni powers like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and then you have Turkey on the side, and you got Iran, which is freaking countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates out. They're really threatened by those guys. They know Israel's not going to start. Israel's never started a war with any of its neighbors. Right. So, there's, that great saying in the Middle East, my enemy's enemy is my friend. A lot of this is coming out of a practical realization that we need to align ourselves with people who are really going to be on our side and have common interests. The interest is opposing radicalism and Iran. It's also out of complete burnout on the part of a lot of Arab states with the Palestinians. Like, how many decades are you guys going to go on acting like this? Why do I have to put money into you? You're just an obstacle to us developing. And countries like the Emirates, UAE is Europe finally getting it right. Instead of artificially creating these countries that have no cohesion like Iraq, Sunni Shiites, Kurds that have nothing in common and don't get along, they finally realize that the Middle East is tribal and religiously divided. And if you look, your listeners the watchers should look at a map of how these Emirate states are divided. They're like little fiefdoms. They're like states in America. You have a certain amount of autonomy and a certain amount of cohesive unity, but you have a lot of independence and you can keep your own area. It works much better. And these guys are Bedouins. The UAE is one giant family. It's one, and Bedouins, by the way, the rest of the Arab world looks down on them, but they think they're the real true Arabs. They're extremely loyal. Their word is their honor, and they see a great opportunity here. So this is sort of Israel leapfrogging over its neighbors, most of which are in pathetically bad shape. Syria, right. Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon. These countries are such loser states that could be such winners if they had peace with Israel. And just going to the Arab states, which while seemingly quite Muslim, they're very religious states. They're not secular states like a lot of the other Arab states were more secular. But these guys are truly interested in having a strategic and economic relationship with Israel. And it's sort of like, what Egypt did cost Sadat his life for making peace with Israel in 1979. Now you got basically 4 countries have peace treaties. We're already on the way to being up to, maybe a quarter of the Arab League is going to have peace treaties with Israel. And I think you're going to see more and more of it. So this is really a game changer. And I think will it last? I don't know. But I think as the bigger issues, the geopolitical realities, the economic and strategic challenges, these countries wake up to it. They're going to recognize that there's a lot to be gained by having a relationship with Israel and very little to be lost by doing that. So I think it's huge. And unlike the peace with Egypt and with Jordan, which is a cold peace, there's no cultural exchange. They hate our guts, especially Jordanians. Really, they're the same people as the Palestinians because these are all the same Arabs. Mm-hmm. They just have random names they took upon themselves based on what they artificially created borders, like Palestinians, Jordanians. There's no difference. The same people. These are not ancient peoples. Jordan is not an ancient country. That we're going to see now that these other states that are further away from us, that aren't so traditionally hostile, that were never at war with us. We're not making a peace treaty with United Arab Emirates or Bahrain. We're normalizing relations. Mm-hmm. So, and unlike those countries like Jordan and Egypt, where it was always nasty to go there, they really want us there. All the hotels have to have kosher food. I think it's going to be, we'll remember this conversation. I'm pretty sure when things normalize because of COVID-19, that UAE is going to be the hottest tourist destination for Israelis. I can promise you.
Okay,
Every
let's watch.
Israeli is going to want to go there.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
so
let's watch.
desperate to have that relationship, and they're going to be so happy to go somewhere people, you like Israelis used to go to Turkey before Erdogan. It was the number one tourist destination.
Yeah.
We do anything for peace. We love anyone who wants to be nice to us. We'll give you our money. We'll give you our technology.
And I just saw the first kosher restaurant opened in Dubai, in the tallest building in the world. Did I see that?
I think so. Yeah. I
Yeah,
heard that also.
yeah.
It was just unbelievable.
Yeah, we'll have to go check it out.
Maybe they'll have bungee cord jumping after the meal.
Maybe. I don't know if that will help digest or the opposite, but anyway, that's very interesting. So I love to hear your take on what's happening. In your opinion, will this continue? Will other Arab states follow?
I think so. There'll be more, not necessarily Arab, but Muslim states, because
Okay.
there's 22 states of the Arab League, and there's, I think, 56 countries that have Islam, like many of the states in North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a lot to do, I think a lot will depend on, first of all, big thing is US elections. I see Trump is really on the war path, trying to do deals, with peace treaties with Israel. He's putting a lot of pressure and offering a lot of stuff. I don't know if Biden gets reelected. I have a feeling that will not continue that way. I think a lot depends on which Arab states are willing to take the leap before there's an Israel-Palestinian agreement. But in my opinion, if the Arabs really cared about the Palestinians, they would tell them to grow up, because the number one thing that will trigger peace, Tony Blair just said this. It was fascinating. He's the former Labour Prime Minister of England, who was in charge of the Middle East peace negotiator for the European Union. He said, we got it all wrong. It's amazing. He's exactly validating what Trump is doing. He's saying the way to get peace with the Palestinians is for Israel, because when you feel you have an enemy within you who's attacking you and enemies without, you're only willing to risk stuff when you feel secure. And when you feel so, if you change the whole paradigm, that it's not like within, without, we break this kind of connection of the Arab world's rejection of Israel with the Palestinian issue, and the Palestinians realize, hey, we're losing our support. We can't just keep acting like petulant, spoiled terrorist children. Israel's doing great. We better just grab what we can while we can before we end up totally isolated and Qatar stops giving us money, which is basically keeping them going in Gaza. So that could be, if the Arabs are really smart and they don't really care about the Palestinians, that's clear to me. But if I think they really wanted to push the peace process forward, the more Arab states truly normalize relations with Israel, I think the quicker you would actually see a normalization of a relationship with Palestinians. Not necessarily the leadership they have now. Mahmoud Abbas is in the 15th year of his 4-year term. These are not democracies. They're not stable countries. They're not industrialized. Hamas is even worse. But I think the average the talk on the street that I know of is that many of the Palestinians, Abbas is threatening to end the Palestinian Authority and give it all back to Israel to be the occupying power. Apparently, a lot of the Palestinians are, please, can we have Israel back? Because Palestinian Authority and Hamas, especially is so corrupt, and so not doing anything to make their people any better lives, like Gaza. Sharon gave them Gaza. What do? They threw the Palestinians out, and they've turned it into a terrorist launching site. There could be all of these technology parks. There could be such a great symbiotic relationship between the Arab population of Gaza and the communities around there. It would be paradise. Beautiful beaches, hotels. Just got to be normal. Got to be normal.
Yeah. I came to sort of my realization of the depth of the corruption in the Palestinian state when I was visiting Mount Gerizim near Nablus, and my guide who was with me pointed to a huge building, and he said, "What do you think that is?" And I mean, it was so massive. I thought it was like some sort of temple or great monument of history. He said, "No, that was Arafat's house." I couldn't believe it. I'm with my camera. I'm zooming in on this place, and it's unbelievably massive. And I'm thinking, okay, so where does the aid money go? And that's That's the thing,
He's a
right?
multi-billionaire, as is Abbas, by the way. The
Yeah.
Palestinians, interesting factoid, I don't know if it's still true, but it was, that the UN has one body for all refugee issues in the world, which deals with tens of millions of people.
Right.
And the Palestinians are the only people in the world who have their own, it's called UNRWA.
Yep.
It's existed since 1948 to deal just with them. And UNRWA's budget exceeded the budget of all refugee issues in the world combined. They've addicted these people to welfare, not just in Israel, not just in these camps, but also in the surrounding Arab states. And we know that welfare states don't work. You see in America the danger of doing that. You see it anywhere in the world.
It's true.
You addict people to giving them free stuff and allow them to get away with literally murder while not holding them accountable for anything and making them feel they're entitled to everything. And they end up being the biggest losers, and the people in there, and they are. They've never, the great line that said, Yasser Arafat never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, one last question, then I'm going to let you go because I know you got other stuff to do. But what has this done internally in the land of Israel, this peace deal? Has it had a negative impact in terms of the Palestinians and their relationship with Israel, their aggression against Israel? Has it kind of ramped things up? What's going on?
Well, their anger is not at Israel. I mean, they're always angry at Israel. There's a constant maintenance level of rage at Israel, burning flags and stuff and stepping on pictures of Bibi and whatever. Their rage is directed at the leaders of, countries like the United Arab Emirates. You traitors, you sold us out. You didn't maintain but as you see again, proving yet again, they didn't explode in another intifada violence. One of the only positive side of COVID-19 is, there's very little going on here in terms of things are very quiet.
Good.
In terms of, there's always a lot more going on. Even when I'm living here, I know what's going on, but I have all my kids did the army and they would tell me all these things. And I said, that didn't make the news. That didn't make the news. That didn't make the news. I mean, Israel is a country that lives in a constant state of a state of emergency, preventing terrorism on a level that no one in the Western world, not in Canada, certainly doesn't appreciate, or America. On the ground, you don't feel any different. You don't feel any more tension, none of that here. Nothing's exploded. But I think it's a big wake-up call for the Arab world, and hopefully bottom up, maybe they'll recognize that this is not working. We got to change our leadership. That's what we live in hope. That's the only possible good outcome I could see from their end is demanding change and wanting to get a piece of the pie before it's all sliced up and given to everyone else.
Okay. Great. Well, Ken, thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate you taking some time to chat with me. And I hope that soon we can actually have dinner together somewhere along Jaffa Street or on the Shuk. One of the things I'm saddest about is that I'm fairly certain this COVID-19 will change the landscape of some of my favorite restaurants in Jerusalem. I know here in North America, lots of restaurants, some very successful ones are going out of business because of what's been happening. And so hopefully we'll still be able to get together for dinner.
I hope so soon. And in our days, as we say.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Ken, thanks so much. And
thanks for having me. Take care. Stay sane and healthy in this crazy world.
Yes, we'll do. You also. Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ken Spiro today. And Ken has just such a wealth of information that he is able to share with us. He has learned and knows so much, and some great insight that he shared today about these peace accords and about whether or not peace is going to be lasting in the region. We want to hope and believe that that can be the case. And I encourage you to check out some of Ken's material on his website. Remember, he is Jewish. He is a religious Jew. We are Christian believers. Many of those of you who listen would be Christians, but it's great to get the Jewish perspective and to hear Ken's insight. I think it's very, very helpful to us. I want to remind you that we are a ministry that is coming alongside and praying for and helping many ministries in Israel who are providing practical and humanitarian aid there in the land of Israel. We want to be able to continue to assist them. And if you would like to help us do that, then you can go to our website, firstcenturyfoundations.com, and /donate, so that you can help us with a financial gift. We certainly appreciate your prayers as well. And just want to say again, thank you for listening. God bless you. And remember, as Christians, we stand with Israel.